The castle has always been something awe-inspiring. These massive stone structures have left their mark on the landscape for centuries. They served a plethora of different functions other than the most basic function of defense. Castles were living, breathing testaments to a ruler's dignity, how much power they possessed, and how wealthy they were. A castle, you see, was much more than a defensive structure. It was a statement of power, a home, a palace, and much more. This is why after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror built castles all over England to show off his ambition, strength, and might. Many people have a misconception that castles were all dull and grey on the inside, just how they appeared on the outside. But this could not be further from the truth. Most if not all castles were serving dual purposes and also were meant as a home for the residing lord or baron of the land. They were very well decorated, from the ceilings to the walls, and even the glass windows. Castles were a host of visiting dignitaries from all around the known world. Often diplomats would visit trying to strengthen the relations of their realm. If they couldn't get an audience with the king at the time, they would quite often stay with the lord or lady as their guests. Until the king summoned them, of course. Therefore, the castle needed to be comfortable with enough furnishings. This mask of being impregnable from the outside and hospitable on the inside is what made these magnificent structures so fascinating. Similar to other medieval buildings, there were different types of castles, and each castle was designed differently, some more than others. There were different styles and types of castles as the medieval era progressed, and this ingenuity and rapid rate of improvement upon them all the time is why they dominated the landscape to this day. The first type of castle to take into consideration is the Motte and Bailey Castle, or more commonly known as a moat nowadays. This structure had a central keep, made out of wood or stone, and was constructed on an elevated piece of land, mostly referred to as a motte, and had an enclosed courtyard or bailey. And all of this was surrounded by a protective well-dug ditch and a protective stockade. The bridge over the ditch connected the whole thing together. The ditch, however, oftentimes would be filled with water to make it that much harder for the opposing army. These types of castles were built right after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. It was William the Conqueror's way of telling everyone that they were here to stay. Also, in hindsight, not only was he stamping his authority over the land, but was setting up defensive structures in key areas of the land to make sure he can crush any uprising. After all, there were a few thousand Normans as compared to the locals. They needed to be well protected and ready for anything. The second style of castle was a much more simplistic one, yet very effective. The rectangular keep, also known as a donjon or dungeon. They were constructed primarily in the 11th and 12th centuries, but kept being improved and given extensions as the time period progressed. The perfect example of this castle was the Tower of London, imposing and striking fear into the hearts of people at the very mention of the very name. Back in the Middle Ages, it was just simply known as a tower. These castles were used as dungeons as well. We can take the example of the two princes in the tower who were imprisoned by their uncle Richard of Gloucester. These types of castles were a general improvement over the Motte and Bailey Castle, primarily because they were made out of better, thicker quality stone. However, that came with one caveat. Because the stone was so heavy, it could not be constructed on top of a motte. What made the structure interesting was the entrance. This was located on the second floor. This made it much harder for the residing lord's enemies to gain access to these castles. These castles were also surrounded by a curtain wall, much like the bailey. Another style of castle which developed in the 13th century was the shell keep, a very basic design, circular in shape, with various types of buildings inside it. Some of the modern bailey castles had been upgraded to a shell keep. Of course, most of the wood structures would be replaced with stone ones, Another good example of this type of castle would be Restormel Castle in England. Finally, the last type of castle we come across is known as a concentric castle. It's a combination of both the shell keep and the rectangular keep. They were built during the 13th and 14th centuries. With these types of castles, walls are imperative. The keep is surrounded by a wall, which is also surrounded by another curtain wall. Sometimes these castles had moats in between the concentric circular areas on the outermost sides of the castle. This was the ultimate means of defense, as there were a series of defensive structures one needed to go through one by one to get to the keep, and even then, there was the actual keep, which the attackers had to take. All in all, this particular type of castle was impregnable. Eventually, as time progressed and the Renaissance started, these fascinating buildings were extended and developed into palaces. That is when defense started to matter less, and trying to make the castle more glamorous was the end goal. Although even then the internal and exterior design had medieval influences, as that was the height of fashion and portrayal of wealth at the time. Castles have dominated and decorated the land for over 1,000 years, and they continue to do so. It's important that we understand their significance because not only were they sentinels of defense, but also were a symbol of majesty, power, and magnificence. The stories that these giants possess within their stone walls are truly epic.